Hello. Yes, thank you. I think the answer to that question is very related, actually, to the presentation we've just heard, because much of what we are talking to the formers about are identity-based dynamics, and they, given the chance to reflect on their engagement and disengagement journeys, they will actually reflect very concretely on the way in which the us and them dynamics, which was just referenced by my colleagues here, were very much part of their engagement and then disengagement journey. So I'm going to be touching on that in this presentation, obviously. So I'd just like to say that this work that I'm going to be presenting on comes from two pieces of work by the researchers involved. That's myself and Anna Kruglova, who couldn't be here today. But this work that is on the screen, called Reclaiming Our Narratives, is a practical guide to countering what we call identity-based disinformation. It's now relatively well known as a term in the sector, but disinformation that is explicitly manipulating and utilizing the idea of us and them rhetoric in order to have its effect and get people mobilized to hatred or of course, violence. And so this work is currently out, and there's a Voxpol article that links to, which explains the work more and links to it. But it's this work combined with Anna's very interesting recent book on terrorist recruitment and propaganda and branding, selling terror online. We've tried to sort of combine these perspectives on identity-based disinformation and the tactics and techniques that are used to mobilize people or trigger people, if you like, around identity, and the way in which propaganda includes all kinds of traditional sales techniques, branding techniques, which was the focus of Anna's work. So coming together, Anna and I and another colleague, John Wilson, have been asking the question of formers, as we've been doing ethnographic interviews with formers, to try and build up a bit of an evidence base that gives us some ammunition, if you like, to build what we call alternative narratives. And alternative narratives, I'm sure everyone's heard of. We have a very specific definition of what alternative narratives are. We actually use a phrase called equal alternative narratives that I'll be explaining shortly. Our key question is, how can alternative narratives address the identity-based needs exploited by extremist propaganda? So we're very much at the start of this research phase of this project. We're applying for funding, waiting for results on that, but we have started our ethnographic interviewing, and we've interviewed 6 or 7, I think now, formers. We're talking to them about their engagement and disengagement journeys, and we're specifically interested in the ways in which they feel that these aspects of identity and something we call universal human needs, which I'll explore shortly, are being exploited in order to motivate them to join and keep membership of the groups that they were a part of. So the theoretical foundation, I think, is kind of interesting to flag up these links between terrorist propaganda and commercial marketing. We see in terrorist propaganda the emotional connection with audiences that is very much part of that propaganda. We see narrative storytelling, as many people here have referenced in different conversations. And something we're very interested in at the OICD is this identity fulfillment angle, this idea that we actually all need certain universal identity aspects to be fulfilled, and I'll come to breaking those down shortly. And that terrorist propaganda actually does a really good job. If the propaganda is successful, it tends to touch those identity-based buttons very well, and that's obviously something we need to take into account. It builds brand loyalty, as Anna's book has talked about in some length. Commercial marketing does pretty much the same thing, right? Which is why we're kind of interested in the connections, creates some emotional connections with customers, uses narrative advertising, promises self-transformation, and builds brand loyalty. So the key implication here is if terrorist groups use marketing weapons, we must respond with their own tactics, outcompeting the extremist narratives with positive alternatives that fulfill the same needs constructively. And actually, I'm going to use a word equal instead of positive, because actually the best counter/alternative narratives don't necessarily have to be positive, they can be neutral, but you get the idea. We're creating alternative narratives that are not the ones that are being used to mobilize people towards violence. Many of you will have come across a model, perhaps, things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's a great model called the Good Lives model. There are lots of psychological, anthropological, sociological, interdisciplinary needs-based models. At our organization, we've tried to adapt them into this one, which we're calling the universal needs model. It's got 4 elements, and we can essentially, by doing similar methodologies to my colleagues over here, discourse analysis, etc., we can normally distill in any extremist propaganda any of these 4 elements, and actually we can come up with a different proportion of each in an analytical framework. So we're looking at, I won't go through each one in detail, but these are pretty familiar to us. The need for belonging and connection, the need for self-esteem, status and significance. There's a need to be part of a moral universe where we feel kind of in control, or at least have some agency around justice and equality. And there's a need for security and to be free of fear and suffering. Now, ordinarily, if we're lucky, these needs in all of us are fulfilled in our everyday lives through positive community values and memberships. But of course, when these needs are unmet in particular populations, they become areas where terrorist recruitment agents or propaganda itself can plug the gaps and attempt to fulfill these needs that are being unmet. And of course, that's really where we come in with trying to understand how to counter that. So, as I say, we've just begun these interviews, but one of the interesting things is how much our first sort of tranche of interview responses really support this idea of identity and this needs exploitation being central to the engagement and disengagement of the people we're speaking to. In fact, without trying to insert, as a bad researcher, we're not going to try and put words in their mouth about, please tell me all about your identity. Identity is a key word that they often bring up, and I think in every case that word has come up, generated by the interviewee, and some dimension of identity, those 4 needs that I've just displayed to you there, is always present. And actually, many of the people we speak to are incredibly articulate about how to explain what's happened to them in terms of these identity-based needs. So an example is, this individual, Dave, saying belonging is in the top 5 reasons why I think I ended up in the group. I was adopted, so I was always searching for some kind of familial thing, some sort of family. When I moved to the West Coast, I didn't know anyone. That became an instant mechanism to connect to people. So just a very straightforward need to belong, driving engagement. Power and self-esteem, the power that you feel when you join a group like that, the fear that you can induce in other people ends up being a way to feel good about oneself, feel self-esteem, feel some kind of value. And so I'm just giving you 2 very short extracts there, but the sort of 90-minute ethnographic interviews with these individuals, that's a bit of a characterization of how people speak about their lives going in and out of these groups. Now, one of the interesting things is that we see that the fulfillment of these needs that are otherwise being exploited with some sort of alternative, non-extremist option is often, in fact, always in our interview so far, part of their disengagement journey, right? So in this individual's life, for instance, I wanted to belong to my family rather than the gang. So after he's joined this group, he's in it for many years, and he eventually marries and has a child. And, so there is some great research, I'm sure some of us are aware of here, about those disengagement journeys and how family can come in and help us to disengage. But here, very specifically, it's the fact that the family is now this new belonging area that offers belonging unconditionally, that allowed Dave to sort of analyze his own disengagement journey as fulfilling that set of needs in a way that didn't mean he had to belong to the terrorist group. So this is, again, reflected in many of the interviews we've been doing. We see identity and significance, that groups are targeting the sense of self of these individuals. That, as I say, the ones that have disengaged that we speak to are very articulate in being able to explain that that's why they think that's happened to them. these individuals have said that their identity was under threat in some way. Either they were lonely or they were made to feel a victim of whatever the ideological, not all ones are ideological, but often it's ideology, of course, that structures the victim narratives. Offering solutions through group membership, promising elevated status and purpose. There's this emotional manipulation that goes on, which I've spoken about. And again, some key insights across these interviews. All interviewees have so far demonstrated that identity-based needs drove their engagement. When these needs were met through alternative pathways, family, positive community, constructive purposes, disengagement became possible. I'm just going to skip over this because I don't want to run out of time, but we do see in extremist propaganda more generally how this setup is accomplished, how these needs are exploited, and we obviously see identity-based imagery used a lot, the narrative storytelling that puts the individual in an epic, often, story, which adds to the emotional ability to emotionally manipulate, puts them at the center of the story again, and then that has this emotional effect. And one of the things that I feel is often under-analyzed is the false choices that are embedded in this set of propaganda messages that we see in every propaganda, including disinformation as well as extremism propaganda, which creates the false choice that you have to, in order to be this thing, in order to be, say, British, some of the people we're interviewing, you have to adopt a particular kind of gender identity or a particular kind of ethnic identity or a religious identity. So this fusing together of cultural markers in deterministic narrative structures is something that I think requires more analysis in an ongoing way. Something that we see in every one of the interviews we've done and also in our other work as well. So the solution that we're trying to push for, as I mentioned at the beginning, is equal alternative narratives. So this is a strategic, systematic approach to the construction of alternative narratives. This is not a debunking, blocking, or censoring approach. This is an approach which actually introduces narratives into the ecosystems where people may be vulnerable or being radicalized in an ongoing way. And the idea is to use the same marketing sophistication as the negative narratives, but instead of debunking or counter-messaging, what we're doing is we're trying to expand the fulfillment or the number of identity options that are on offer, providing a narrative optionality. This is about giving people choice rather than restriction. So it ties in quite well, of course. Our keynote speaker was talking about the response to the technology companies and the geopolitical differences with content moderation. We feel that an identity-based approach helps us to sort of leapfrog or dodge some of these important conversations and get something out that could be effective. We see multiple pathways to needs fulfillment being the thing that equal alternative narratives do, and that's the reason we call them equal alternative narratives rather than counter narratives, because they are supposed to be providing for the same needs that the propaganda narratives exploit, and that's the key reason we call them equal, because they're seeking to be equal in their effectiveness over identity-based provision. How am I doing for time, Maria? We've got a minute more? 1 minute, thank you, okay. So the idea of doing this as a responsive sort of approach is interesting, but we're very keen to make sure that we have a protective element here. If we can get into school curriculums, we've been working with the Department of Education in the UK, for example, on whole school approaches. If we can plant alternative narratives, equal alternative narratives into ecosystems prior to dangerous propaganda hitting those ecosystems, we believe there's a protective force to be built there, and this goes back to resilience, again mentioned by our keynote speaker earlier. So there are 7 steps. I'm just going to very quickly mention them and then show you the resource again. So our resource that I'll show in a second essentially walks the practitioner through how to analyze these campaigns. We look at disinformation, but the strategy is the same. We are trying to identify which needs are being exploited and how. We then understand the target audiences and their general identity layers and needs. We develop those alternative narratives that fulfill the needs positively, which is a kind of creative exercise, not unlike a marketing team sat in a agency. We identify trusted voices. To my colleague Gordon here just presented on that, which is rich research that would help us to do that more effectively, and authentic channels within communities. We then craft those resident messages using the storytelling strategies identified in the previous phase. We design for invisibility. We find that these narratives are actually much more effective when they're not seen as counter-narratives, right? And then we try and scale through community networks and authentic relationships. I'm going to stop there. I feel my time is running out. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone.